and in this video I will be building the Buster Sword from Adventure Time.
That sword's too unwieldy, man.
But it'll look decent when I triple combo this bozo with this thing, right?
Like how?
Like this, bro!
On second thought, maybe I'd rather do the one from Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Before we begin with this project, I need to mention something. The modus operandi for making a Buster Sword, and it's weird that that is a thing, is to order a giant piece of metal, cut off the tip, make the handle, and you're basically done. The only problem with that method is that the blade is usually a lot thinner than in the original game. Now there are swords like, for example, the Royal Greatsword, where that isn't really a problem. But on other swords, like the Farron Greatsword, for example, where the side plates basically indicate that the blade has the same thickness as the handle, that is a big problem. So for years now I have been wondering, could you make one of those giant swords with a hollow blade? Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to create a blade that is as wieldable as the one in game. I'm basically trying to make a blade with the correct thickness and still have it be liftable, droppable. I hesitate to use the word wieldable. The first step was to get this pipe into an oval shape, and this will be the first of many times where I will praise the designers of the Buster Sword on how great of a job they did, because this sword has an oval handle, which is something way too many video game swords don't have. It is now time for the first difficult operation on this project, and again I have to praise the designers of this sword, because the Buster Sword in its latest iteration has a distal taper. That is something far too few fantasy swords have. It basically means that the blade gets thinner in its thickness. That made a lot of sense, I guess. Basically you can imagine it like this triangle. For the sake of my own sanity and the money I already spent before noticing that, I will make something like a partial distal taper. I will make the blade a uniform thickness up until this point. I hope you can see this. Maybe this helps. Up until this point, all the way to the tip. And this will look basically like this wedge here. Coincidentally, that is the only way the weird blade tip segment makes any sense, because it gets super narrow down at the tip. You probably won't be able to see the scribed lines on here, so you will just have to trust me that I'm doing the right thing. In case you can make out how this is held in place, don't question my methods, I don't have any other. I just thought of something curious. If you couldn't make out what I was doing here, you have no idea what I'm doing right now. I was welding this piece of frame for the tip on. When ordering the material, I did not account for the fact that this edge from this side here is longer than the edge from this side here. That basically made it necessary to create one extra piece. These will be welded together to be the tip segment and then be welded on the main blade segment. So I could basically do it without ordering more steel, so I'm quite happy with how that turned out. And this here is basically the bread and butter of the build. The two relatively thin plates are clamped together at an angle. At first I will just put some spot welds on. This is a nut with an isometric M36 thread in it. And this is the same type of nut that spent the night in vinegar. As you can see, all the galvanized zinc is off. And that basically only serves the purpose that I don't die when I work with that. And now I need to get this nut down to the thickness. God damn you, German accent. And now I need to get this nut down to the thickness that is marked here all the way around. It has now been a couple of weeks since the last time I recorded anything, so please excuse me if I don't know what's going on. For the material slots, I wanna do something special, but for now I will just weld this big nut on here. For that purpose I've screwed a bolt in here so that the spatter doesn't get into the thread. If the little LCD screen is anything to go by, you won't see much here other than a vaguely buster sword shaped thing, which is a good thing because that means I now have the side plates attached, currently via some little screws. As mentioned earlier, those will be ground off once I'm done. So the next step is to put some weld around here and then eventually on the backside, but I don't know when I will get to do that yet. And after 3 rounds of welding and grinding and a little side quest of me getting into MIG welding, this is now what we have. And what I can already say at this point is that the experiment is a giant failure. Because, I don't know if you can see it or not, due to the welding heat, the sheet metal side plates deformed and now the sides are no longer flat. But since I've already spent a whole lot of time making this thing so far, and I don't really feel like giving up now, I will continue building this hunk of junk. And once again, I have to praise the people who created the in-game model for this sword. The blade has a really interesting design. It looks like when it was first produced at the factory, it was just ground in this direction. But then over the years you can see where a whetstone has left marks in this direction, just on the cutting edge. Real great attention to detail. Now these 4 bolts, I guess, are what will hold the materia in place. And after rounding the top sides and polishing them a little bit, the next step would be to get an angle in here from this edge to the inside. I cut 2 corners off of a square tube to create these angled pieces that I can then bend around the side plates to create the border that circumferences them. And now that I have filed these grooves in, I can bend it and then it will wrap around like this one. And once these 3 pieces are welded together, they will form what is colloquially known as the materia slots. Now that both the materia slots are welded together from all the separate parts, I can weld them onto the blade. For that I have used the bolts that will hold the materia in place to get the right position. I can't remember if I've showed you all of those before. Those are the side plates that will be attached to the blade. And that was the last of all those plates that were attached to the blade. What you're seeing here is basically the other side of this piece. And I will now spot weld the rivet heads to the metal plate. And this is what is basically considered the handguard for this giant sword. I don't think I filmed really much of making it until this point because it was just more spot welding, and I noticed at some point all those clips for doing these tiny little spot welds all look the same, so... I'm sorry for that. For the collar near the handguard, I first need to remove a slot where the handle can't fit through. Usually this would be the last step if we go by textbook, but since I'm afraid I wouldn't really be able to clamp the final shape, I will do this first. And sorry. And now to file this sucker. And to create this piece of the collar here. I have already bent this thing into shape. It started out as just a piece of flat stock that I bent into shape. Then I put a weld on here and ground everything back. And now I basically just need to add the little grooves that you see in here and round everything over, and then this piece is already done. This here used to be two oval rings that are now welded together all the way around. And that will form the other end of the collar piece. I just have to take down this side to round it over a bit. At this point, the bottom and the two flat sides of the pommel are basically done. Now, I could spend hours trying to attach this pommel to the handle by welding it on. Well, the welding wouldn't be the problem. The adjusting it into the right position would be. First off, I don't really know how I would clamp that, and it would take hours and more of my nerves that I can spare to get it into the right position. So instead, I will drill a hole through the pommel and then attach something like an extra piece of tang to the handle. And here we have the finished pommel, and this is the little tang extension I mentioned. I don't know how much of the last recording you saw. I basically just added this little tang extension to the tang, but when I came to check on the battery, the entire thing had already shut off, so okay, so here's the situation. The footage of the cold bluing got corrupted. The next step is to create the materia. For that I will use epoxy resin, and since that's a process where I have to wear my respirator the whole time, I will now explain to you what's going on and then do it afterwards, and if I'm really good, I will cut it together that I'm explaining while doing it. Editing Michael, you know what to do. First off, we take the epoxy resin, around 10 grams, maybe a bit more. Then we take the hardener, around 5 grams. Basically, ratio is 1 to 2, or 2 to 1, rather. Now we stir it. And now we add a few drops of sky blue. Now we stir this again. And then we pour it into the mold. The rest of the stuff gets poured into other molds just so that the cup can still be used for other applications. Now once that is done, we add a few drops of starry blue. And then we just carefully wipe it around the edges of the mold. Because, you see, it will set over the next few days and sink to the ground. And by just barely covering the outer area of the mold, we will assure that the piece is still light enough that the light will go through. I'd say these look acceptable. This is number 1. This is number 1. I'm not sure if it's in or just... Who knows? Now you've probably noticed that the materia isn't really a sphere, so it's important to seat it properly to get the maximum amount of amounts. I don't know. This is very slippery. This is also a little bit far out. What is going on? Okay, I think this is not perfect, but should be good enough. Now, ideally, you get some light from the background, and then they look really cool. Would be probably even cooler if you could light them or illuminate them the way they are, but I thought about that, and that would require a whole lot of electronics inside a giant sword that will be swung around with a lot of force, and I don't think they would survive very long. You can do that on a cosplay prop, but for an actual sword, I don't think that would lead anywhere. So we'll do it like this. Pretty much the last step on the sword is to wrap the handle. For that I have already cut one corners of a stripe of leather. And I will basically start by using one of Michael Cthulhu's tried and true methods to use a pop rivet to secure everything in place. Now, as always, it would be better if I had 4 hands for this, but in the past 2 were usually enough, even though it is a bit of a struggle. This really can't stop myself from grabbing right into the glue. Third hand, where are you?